Well, in the church, in the church calendar, Easter is a season. It's a celebration. And so we are continuing in that Easter season and Easter reality this morning and remembering the resurrection and all that it means through the Gospel of John. So if you were with us last Sunday to celebrate Easter, if you got a chance to listen to the teaching, you know that we're saying that John wants us to think of the resurrection not just as a Christian creed, right? Something that Christians believe, and not just as a historical fact, something that actually happened. And by the way, we want you to accept both of those. That's true. But we want you to see the resurrection even more so as something that is transformational, something that has changed everything for those who believe in its veracity, believe in its truth and reality. And specifically that it brings new creation, a permanent sense of new creation to the world and anyone who is in Jesus. And then also the permanent presence of God with us. And therefore all things are changed, all things are being made new. Now over the next 3 weeks as we continue in this Easter celebration, we're going to look at 3 specific examples, 3 individuals who John records parts of their story and their interaction with the resurrected Jesus. And we're going to see how it transforms things for them, and then therefore comprehend how that might also be true for us. This morning we want to hear the story of Jesus' interaction with a lady named Mary, who comes from the area of Magdala, sometimes often referred to as Mary Magdalene. So if you copy the scriptures, you can turn to John chapter 20. If not, no worries, we'll have it up on the screen for you. John chapter 20, verse 11. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." And at this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was him. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I'll go get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said, "Don't hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to the Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. The word of God for the people of God. So here's what I want to do. I want to sort of retell the story. You're saying we read it, we get it, but I want to retell the story and try to make some observations together. And then on the basis of that, I want to draw 3 really big conclusions of what the resurrection or interacting with the resurrected Jesus has done for Mary, and begin to suggest what that might mean for us. Make sense? So, as we read this story, several things are happening. And I've tried to tell you as we've gone through the whole Gospel of John, John's a storyteller, right? And so he's telling, especially when he tells details, or details that you might think, well, why did he say that? Well, they probably have meaning that we ought to wrestle with. And so some of that is, again, going on in this story. You have Mary lingering at the tomb of Jesus. If you remember the story from last week, Mary comes to apply spices to the body of Jesus to continue the preparation for burial or for caring for the body after burial. And she sees the stone rolled away. And she goes and gets Simon, Peter, and John. And of course, Simon, Peter, and John have a race. John wins. John's careful to tell us he wins the race to the tomb. But he stands at the outside, and then Peter, being Peter, just blazes right through, right on in. You remember this. And then it says they believed, but they didn't understand what had happened, and they went away. Well, now we realize they went away, but Mary did not. And this becomes really important in trying to understand this story. Mary stays there, and she's crying. And so at the core, I want to suggest to you, really one of the keys to unlocking what's happening here is answering the question that keeps getting asked of Mary, right? The angels say to Mary, what? Why are you crying? Then she meets Jesus, and before knowing who he is, he says to her, what? Why are you crying? And he begins to interpret for her by saying, what are you looking for? If we can answer this question, we're going to be able to unlock this whole section of Scripture, this whole pericope, as it were, and begin to make some sense of it for us. Why is Mary crying? Well, the obvious answer is because Jesus has been crucified, right? That would have been completely upending to someone like her and to all the disciples. But there's clearly more going on here. She say, thoughtfully, well, she's disturbed that someone would steal his body and desecrate it or do something horrible with it or whatever she might assume is going on. And this, again, would be deeply troubling to her. But something more is going on here, and we can see it as we see the whole story unfold and the way Jesus interacts with her. She's looking for Jesus. She's not just looking for the body of Jesus. Because it was in Jesus that she had found something radically different in her life. It was in Jesus that she had found, maybe for the first time, true meaning, real identity, honest to goodness dignity as a human being. Now, we are not privy to the full backstory of Mary, but the little pieces we know, we could safely say she came from a scandalous past, right? People have supposed she was a prostitute. Well, we don't really have any truth to know that. Could it be? Sure. One of the gospel writers tells us that she had several demons removed from her. And we have that. And this mention of Magdala, right? She's Mary Magdalene. Why do we need to know where she's from? Well, on one hand, because everyone in the New Testament seems to be named Mary, right? And so we got to make sense of who's who and who's going on here. But on the other hand, they're identifying her with a geographic place that comes with some sense of worldliness. Magdala was kind of like, in that day, a kind of a worldly place where people kind of did other things, weren't necessarily living the consecrated life. And so we're aware without being aware that Mary is a lady, a person, a human being who comes to Jesus with significant baggage. But in Jesus, she's found profound acceptance. She's found honor and dignity, and she's found a renewed purpose for her life. She's found the very thing that her soul longs for. She's found what I would call true identity. And so what you have going on with Mary, for certain, is utter grief over the death of Jesus and utter frustration and distraughtness over what seems to be the stealing of his body to desecrate it. But even more so, the incredible internal grief that's going on because what she thought she had gained, she now has lost. Does this make sense? And so it's a reversion for her back to the old Mary, or at least as the world would see her. Jesus says, so what are you looking for? And of course, she's looking for him. Not just his body, but a hope that somehow what he was saying, what he was offering, the truth that he had been giving her, could somehow still possibly be true. And Jesus shows up into this moment in a pretty profound way. Now think about this with me for just a second. Peter, who many people would go on to believe becomes the leader of the church, as it were, right? The entire Roman Catholic Church is built around the idea that Peter is the head of the church. And there's some level of truth to that going on, maybe especially after the martyrdom of James in Jerusalem. And then you have John, the so-called person who says of himself that the one Jesus loved, right? I'm the guy that Jesus loved. Now, I shouldn't poke too hard because I do believe he's trying to say that in humility, not in puffed up arrogance. But these two guys are on the scene, but neither of them see Jesus. What do we make of that? Jesus, we have to conclude, intentionally waits for them to leave so that he can interact individually with Mary. Now, Jesus is capable of all kinds of things. We see this happen post-resurrection when he walks through walls and stuff, right? So he could make this happen any number of different ways. But something profound is happening that he's saying the first person that I want to see me in resurrected state is this woman. That should speak pretty profoundly to us, right? Not the ones who have the perfect background, not the ones who have the height of religious resumes. But ultimately, my conclusion is, why does he come to her? Because she's desperately looking for him. Guess who aren't? Peter and John, at least in that moment, right? Peter and John are very interested in retreating back to the privacy, seclusion, and therefore protection of their chambers wherever they might be. Jesus is not there to condemn them for that. But here we have Mary, who is throwing all caution to the wind. Never at any moment do we see in Mary someone who is unwilling to be publicly associated with Jesus. And here we see in Mary someone who is desperate to find him, literally coming unglued emotionally, trying to be near him. And Jesus shows up. This is true, friends, that Jesus meets those who are seeking him. That Jesus appears and pursues all of us, but for those who are desperately seeking him, he makes himself fully available. And here we see it again in Mary. And Mary, of course, when she first sees him, errantly calls him a gardener. But John, being ever the great storyteller, says this has got to go in this story. Why? Because as the great New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says, it's exactly the right mistake to make. If you're going to mistake Jesus for anything, mistake him for a gardener. Why? Because he's cultivating new creation. It's once again a way of connecting the resurrection story to the Genesis story of creation. And there he is doing that very thing, but very personally for a particular person, not just abracadabraing it for the whole world. Though we believe Jesus has instituted and is working new creation in the whole world, and what I want you to hear is he's intimately interested in individual Mary in the same way he's intimately interested in individual you. How do we know? Because Jesus calls her by name. Incredible. Mary. And immediately when she hears him speak her name, everything changes. It's the turning point of the story. It's the moment where the script is flipped, as it were. She hears her name. And of course, our minds go immediately back to John 10, hopefully, where Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. And what does he say? The Good Shepherd knows his sheep, and his sheep know his voice. And here we see it, don't we? He calls her by name, knows what she needs, knows he's searching for her, knows she needs shepherding. He calls her by name. She hears and knows and fully responds. Apparently so much so, it's implied, not overly stated, that she lunges for him, right? She grabs a hold of him. Now, we're not given the story, part of the story where she does that. We're given the part of the story where Jesus says, hey, let go, right? As if and let's be careful, right? Jesus is not untouchy-feely. He's not something overly German like me who's like, whoa, a little bit too much here. He's got a different theological point to make at this moment. He says, listen, I have not yet ascended to the Father. Now, what a weird thing to say, isn't it? What a bizarre thing to say. Hey, stop holding on to me. I haven't yet left. Don't you hold on to people so they don't leave, right? But we have to understand, ascension doesn't mean the departure of Jesus. Now, it's part of it. But ascension ultimately means the victorious enthronement of Jesus. The reason the ascension is so critical for Christian doctrine is it's the moment that Jesus takes the throne that is rightfully his. Do you see it? The resurrection vindicates Jesus. He therefore defeats death, and in his ascension he is enthroned. Philippians 2, Paul says, so that every knee will bow and tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, King, over all. So he's saying, hey, listen, Mary, Jesus is basically saying to Mary, hey, listen, if you think what I've done up to this point is cool, just wait. In other words, you get it? Like, don't even hold on to the pre-crucifixion Jesus or even the immediate post-resurrection Jesus. You want the enthroned Jesus. And then he says to Mary, now go tell everyone. And of course, this is what she does. Incredible, powerful story. So let me suggest three things for you. And of course, there's way more here, but for our sake. I said to you, the key to unlocking this is figuring out why is she crying. I've tried to help us understand. My answer to that is certainly over the death of Jesus, but even more so personally for her over everything that's lost because of the death of Jesus. Him and what she has gained through him. Then the turning point in the story is the moment where Jesus calls her name and she hears it. And what happens is everything changes. So let me suggest to you three things that change for Mary and why that's important to us. The first thing that changes for Mary is her perception, doesn't it? Think about the first half of this story. Mary's seeing all kinds of incredible things, and she has no clue what's going on, does she? She's seeing angels in a tomb, and she's talking to them like regular people. She sees the resurrected Jesus and perceives him to be a gardener, right? But immediately, when Jesus calls her by name, she sees him for who he is, and apparently must understand the entire scene of the tomb. How do we know? Because she's the only one who could go back and report what happened, right? And she reports back that there were two angels in white standing there. A very different report than what she had first perhaps perceived and reckoned with. That is, that in hearing the voice of the resurrected Jesus, Mary's eyes are opened to a whole other dimension of being. She has eyes now to see the whole spiritual reality that is at work in this world. And even more so to see the bigger things that God is up to, not just her personal experience therein. Does it make sense? But at some level, Mary is having a Genesis 2 experience, isn't she? She's walking side by side in the cool of the morning with God, and there are angels surrounding her everywhere. And this is an incredible scene. But she has no eyes to see it except through the lens of the resurrected Jesus. Here's what I want you to know. Your experience in the mundane nature of tomorrow's Monday morning, when you go to a job that you hate or a job that you love, or for many of us, a job that's, somewhere in the middle, you're going there because of the resurrection with a whole bigger vision of everything that's at stake and that's actually going on in the world, and the bigger agenda of God to renew all things. Does it affect you personally in the already but not yet? It certainly does. But how do you endure in the midst of it? You have eyes to see the bigger picture of all that is going on. And Mary's opinion of things radically changes, doesn't it? I mean, let's be honest, right? Mary's loss is somewhat dealt with by the reality that Jesus is alive, of course. But he's basically told her, hey, don't hold on to me, I'm leaving. So at some level, that loss remains, doesn't it? At some level, she's already being prepared for the fact that he's going to be with the Father. He's not going to be tangibly present with her in the ways that he has been in the past. But this is actually going to lead to an even greater thing if you have eyes to see it. Makes sense. And so too for us. In the midst of this broken and sometimes chaotic world, and I understand some of you are in the throes of some really challenging things right now, and in no way would I ever want to make little of them, because it is not little, and it's significant, and it's challenging. But because of the resurrection, we have a far greater hope in facing those things than we otherwise would. And though we cry and mourn and grieve and fear in the midst of this broken world, we do have opportunity to search for Jesus in the midst of it and hear him profoundly call us by name if we have ears to hear. And it does change our it does change our interaction with our circumstances, even if it does not change our circumstances. Please don't mishear me if you're facing something super challenging. I am not making small of it. I am not telling you, oh, just buck up. Jesus is resurrected. I'm telling you, he's continuing to offer himself to you in an even more glorious way because of his resurrection, to walk with you through the challenge that you are facing. But it's not just her perception that's changed, is it? It's also her identity that has changed. And again, for me, this is central to this whole passage. You may read it differently, and that's okay. But Mary is crying because she's looking for an identity which had been gained and now is apparently lost. And she has this weird moment with Jesus where he's like, hey, don't hold on to me. I'm leaving. And at some level, I think something's going on here where Jesus is telling her, listen, yes, because of the resurrection, you do not have to be labeled by your past. Right? That identity is washed and gone. The pre-Jesus Mary from Magdala it's taken care of. It's gone. It's washed. You've been given the new identity that I've said to you. But don't even hold on to the hypothetical of that. Instead, let me sit on the throne where your identity can be once and for all settled. Does it make sense? In other words, Jesus is calling Mary to believe in a settled identity that will be fully realized in the future so that she can live in the now. You hear it? We sang that pretty powerfully in the song right before our break. The sense in which, as Christians, our hope is meant to be so settled, our identity is meant to be so firmly fixed that when we face living in the already not yet, the fullness of Jesus' resurrection, but the brokenness of this world, one foot in and one foot out, we can endure at some level because we are certain of the fixed nature of who we are because of the victory of Jesus. That is, that if Jesus is not enthroned, then things are still in fluid nature. But once he's seated on the throne, then everything is fixed and you can be certain of it, no matter what tomorrow might hold for you. And the Apostle Paul picks this up all throughout his writings. In fact, he's going to say in every single bit of his writing that how you face the now is through a fixed identity that you will fully gain in the future. Be certain of it now so that you can live on the basis of it now, even in the midst of chaos and brokenness and pain and struggle and tears. It is that Mary is certainly not who she was, but she's also not just what she's becoming. She actually now is who she will be. You see this? And that changes everything. Because at that moment, your value is no longer dependent upon your performance. It's no longer how you ride out the rest of this life. It's no longer how you're doing day to day. But you're living on the basis of identity, not trying to earn it. Jesus says, don't hold on to me. Don't keep me from making this permanent. In the same way, how much so for us? And then lastly, Mary's vocation has changed, isn't it? Mary's vocation has changed. I love using the word vocation. What I don't mean by vocation is your job that gives you a paycheck, right? We don't know what Mary did for a living. We don't know if she did something for a living, if she was a full-time follower of Jesus in terms of that's what she did with everything, or if there were other things going on. We don't necessarily know. But we do know that what Jesus was saying to her in these moments was not, stop doing that, I've got something totally different for you now. But he was saying to her, now you've seen the resurrected Lord, you got to go tell people. Right? Now listen, maybe it'd be good to do this sometime. We never really have done this in talking about the historical validity of the resurrection of Jesus. But one of the great historical proofs of the resurrection of Jesus is the way the story is told in all of the Gospels. Because the chief witnesses tend to be women, and tend to be oftentimes women who would not necessarily be able to bear witness in the court of law in that day. Again, what I'm saying ought to offend you, but please understand I'm talking to you about a first century reality, not about my particular opinion. So in the first century world of Jesus, for whatever reason, it was only the testimony of men that was upheld, and it was certainly only the testimony of certain kinds of men who were seen a certain way. And so if you were going to write a phony account, you would never write it by saying that all of these women were the true eyewitnesses and they went and told all of the men, right? But Jesus does that because he's reversing things all the time. He's elevating statuses all of the time, isn't he? Because we love him for that. But you can see historical proof even in the way the stories. Shouldn't it be Peter? If he's going to have this huge position in the church someday? No way. He's going back to the room. He's going to hear about it in the same way he heard about the stone being rolled away from Mary. Mary becomes the first gospel preacher. Profound. Now you tease that out how you want to. I'm not necessarily making overt statements, but she's the first one who is sharing the full news of the gospel. I have seen the risen Lord. To all the ones who are going to go on to be the evangelists and the prophets and the whatever, Fascinating. We can't lose sight of this, friends. It is not just the future leaders of the church or the current preachers in the church, but is the everyday people who have experienced the resurrected Jesus, who are called by vocation. Again, I'm not talking about clocking in, clocking out, getting your paycheck, but vocation, voca, right? Latin for call. You've been called to this. You've been called to bear witness to it. Again, look at Mary. Look at what Jesus gives Mary. He does not give her 10 talking points to prove it's true. We're going to find out next week. There's a couple of these disciples who are like, didn't happen. Remember Thomas? Doubting Thomas. We're going to talk about that next week. Jesus doesn't give Mary any of those things. She gives him the simple message, I have seen the risen Lord. Does that leave you with all kinds of questions? Sure. So what is Mary supposed to do? Give an apologetics lecture that is going to convince everyone everywhere that this is true? No. Jesus is simply asking her to tell her story and what it means for her. It is eminently doable, and we are called to it too. Friends, if you don't like that application, don't come back the next 2 weeks, because it's going to happen the next 2 weeks too. Because here's the truth. Anyone who meets the resurrected Jesus is called to tell people about it. Listen, I'm not saying knocking on doors, forcing things down people's throat, but living in a different way. Meeting the moment where people ask questions, whatever it is, there's different ways for different people. I'm not talking about being abrasive in any way, shape, or form. I mean, look at the people who Mary is sent to, people who are wanting to hear the message, right? He doesn't say, hey, go to Pontius Pilate and say, I've seen the Lord, or go to Caiaphas or Annas or any of these people. So there's nuance to all of this, but it changes our purpose. You see it? But listen, in the perfect new creation way, it actually doesn't, does it? It just renews us with our original purpose, which was always to bear the image of God to the ends of the earth for the glory of God. What is the image of God now? Jesus, the perfect image of God. And so we bear the image of God by making much of Jesus to the ends of the earth for the glory of God. It's who we are. It's what we're called to. The resurrection changes everything. And if we are disciples, how do you know if you're a disciple? You hear Jesus call your name, right? That's how you know. And if that is true, if you have that kind of relationship with Jesus, then at least 3 things are different. Many, many more, obviously. But 3 things for us to think about today. Your perception ought to be different. It ought not to be simply isolated around your personal circumstance, though that does not mean to make light or small of anything you are experiencing, because it's real, hard, difficult, challenging, and we all want to rally around you and each other in those ways. But we ought to begin having eyes to see bigger things that God is up to, and that God is permanently present with us, even in the midst of our challenge. Then that our identity is changed, right? And I use the word changed on purpose. It's settled, done. It's not changing. Yeah, you're being changed in this world, of course. That's sanctification and whatever. But sanctification is only engaged upon based on the fixed nature of it. Who you are is settled by the resurrection if you hear Jesus call your name. And then lastly, your vocation, your personal calling. How you go about living your life and orient it is changed. It's renewed to be people who bear the image of God to the ends of the world for the glory of God, who are willing to say, I have seen the resurrected Lord, and this is how it's changing me. You pray with me? God, I again pause and I pray in solidarity with and for my friends who are going through challenging times right now. Would you, in your kindness, would you reach out and touch them in this moment? Would you whisper their name? Would you shout it? Would they hear it? Would they know that you're close, even though the circumstances endure? Would you remind them of what you're up to, who they are, the settled nature of their identity? Would you help us to do that as a church? And then for all of us, God, who oftentimes are looking in the past to form an identity, can we instead look to the enthroned, resurrected Jesus and have a settled identity that changes how we perceive our world and changes what we believe to be our true purpose. Ask all of this, Lord, in your holy name. Amen.